You're listening to the Turn Autism Around podcast, episode number 135. Today I am talking to Chino's mom, Jocabed. I often get asked how the kids that I used to work with, the kids that are in my book, Turn Autism Around, the kids that are in my courses and in my videos, I often get asked how they're doing now. So we're going to get an update from Jocabed about Chino, who's now age 11. We also talk about raising kids in a bilingual home. We talk about the importance of religion and how to navigate that, and just some of the safety concerns that she had when Chino was little. And then we also get an update on how he's doing now, and she gives a lot of great advice for parents and professionals. Jocabed has a master's in special education, and she is a pastor at a church at this time. So she's a wealth of information. She came here to my video studio in my home, and so it was really great to catch up. So I hope you enjoy this special interview with Jocabed. Okay, so Jocabed, thank you so much for coming.
You're welcome.
And joining me today. We've had a lot of requests for how's Chino doing now, and so let's start with your fall into the autism world. When were you concerned? What were you thinking? And when was all that happening?
Yeah, so I think I first became concerned just because of how active he was getting into everything. And I remember him thinking he had no real concept of danger. So I struggled with some safety issues. But I remember there was one day in particular, he's up on his changing table and I'm changing his diaper. And I don't remember what he did that I scolded him about. And I saw this look on his face where I could just tell he wasn't connecting like the scolding with what had just happened. And I was like, there's something going on here.
And how old was he?
He was just under 2.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, you had another child, a little under 3.
Yes, she was just under 3. Yes.
And you had a newborn.
And I had a newborn. Yep.
And so were you thinking autism?
So honestly, I didn't know at first. I wasn't sure. My mom actually gets a lot of credit because she's like, have you ever thought of autism? And she knew that I could take it, it wouldn't offend me. And so when I started looking that up, and then I remember seeing stuff about sensory processing disorders and things like that, and it all kind of started making sense. And after some reading, I was almost convinced, yeah.
Okay. And at that point, did you call the Birth to 3 agency?
Yes. So I don't even remember how I knew. I asked his pediatrician.
Okay.
Yeah. And I actually remember his pediatrician said, I think you're just comparing him to your oldest child because she's doing so well. And I just, in my heart, knew that I was not doing that. I felt something was wrong. And he said, I can still give you the referral if you'd like. And I said, yes, please do so.
Mm-hmm. And you were a teacher by training.
Yes. At that time, I was a stay-at-home mom. But I am a certified teacher, and I had worked a few years before that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so like we said, you had your hands full.
Very full.
And I remember it was right in around 2010.
Yep.
And I had just started working for the Birth to 3 agency in my county. I worked there for with a contract for about 7 years. And Chino was one of my very first clients. And I think he was the first client that I went to that didn't have a diagnosis yet. We were just trialing things out, and I remember really not knowing anything about you or your family or Chino, and coming in, and nobody was talking about autism, so I'm like, ooh, I wrote a book on autism, and I'm just kind of like, ding dong, I'm here. Yeah. And I say this in my book, Turn Autism Around, in the first chapter, I say out of all the hundreds of kids that I worked with, that Chino at 20 months reminded me of Lucas at 20
Yeah.
months. When my husband first mentioned the possibility of autism, because from my point of view, he was kind of a quiet kid. He had a couple what I now call pop out words. And he had, a newborn sister, and he had, a year older sister. And he was just kind of getting into things. I remember you had like taller stools for the kitchen over for the dining area, and he'd knock them over. But then the bassinet or the little child seat could be there, and I was like, whoa, we gotta like really safety proof this.
Well, I remember one time he flipped over it was kind of like those rocker chairs. Now they have like rockaroos. It was similar to that. It just didn't like move on its own. And I remember Chino went up one day and just boom, flipped it over.
With the baby in it.
And the baby was sitting in it.
Oopsie.
She was strapped. So all was well. At our household, she was fine. But it was a really big scare. Yeah. Another scare I had, she was like laying on a blanket, I think every mom does this once in a blue. You got to run and grab something. The baby doesn't flip yet, or, it's a 1 month old. And he pulled the entire blanket off the couch with the baby on it.
Oh my gosh.
And I mean, we had nice plush carpeting, so it wasn't terrible. She wasn't hurt. But these were things that were like, I have to do something.
Right. And your husband was there, but he was working. And so you're trying to manage all three.
So at that point, I was a stay-at-home mom. So that meant that, my husband had to pick up as many hours at work, as he could. And he worked third shift. So basically, we're talking about having a toddler / preschooler, and then having my son, and then having the newborn, getting up at all hours of night with the newborn, and still having to be up in the morning with my son first thing.
And he was, you had to watch him like a hawk.
So
we do have one of the things eventually as I got into my work with Chino and Jocabed and her husband, it was before I really had my established 4-step process and everything. But I had worked for years with the Verbal Behavior Project, so it was just like applying this to really little kids with and without a diagnosis. And I remember you both being very motivated to learn and wanting to sit and learn exactly what we were doing. And I remember having my stat bag, actually, the screening tool for autism in toddlers, in my car, because there was another little boy that I really couldn't tell, and we really needed to figure out what was going on with him. And I had it in my car, and I said, hey, do you mind if I bring it in? Because at that point we were thinking autism. You were on a wait list. It was a 6-month wait list at the time. And so I brought my stat bag in, and I remember that day, right when he was 2, he failed. He got 0.
Yes.
Or he got 4 points. Very 4 points, which is like scoring 0. It's like over the 2 is a cutoff for autism, and he scored. He got no credit for any of the subtests, including the doll subtest, where you hand him a baby doll, and all he has to do is put it in the bed or pretend to feed it, and just very characteristically, he just stirred the cup, stirred with the spoon, and failed the test. And then I remember getting those videos, and one of the really great things about Jocabed and Cody's mom, Jenna, who was on a previous podcast, we can link in the show notes, as well as other moms who've been a part of the journey, who agreed to share their stories in the book or my courses or my webinars, is that because I have all these videos, I'm able to now help people from over 80 countries and really demonstrate exactly what happened, because we didn't know how things were going to turn out either. And so 1 year later, I was almost done working with Chino, because when he was 3, he was going to start with another agency. And so I brought my stat bag back, and we redid the stat. Not that that's really that's not a part of the stat. The stat's used to screen out or in autism, but I personally think it's a really good pre and post.
Yeah.
You can see some major growth if you do it more than
It showed
once.
progress.
Yeah, it showed
overall.
a lot of progress. And so we will link the pre 1 year, the 2-year-old video of the doll subtest and the post, which he was 3. So when he was 3, he didn't score, I think he scored 0.75 or something like that. I mean, obviously he still had autism. He was diagnosed with moderate to severe autism when he was 2.5, but it showed major growth. Like instead of just putting the baby in the doll, he said, "Night, night, baby, wake up."
And he
you
wanted
make
to give her cocoa.
And I couldn't understand what he was saying, but he was pointing. He was trying to show me more, and it just. I mean, all of us in the room, we were like, "What?" Like we were all amazed.
It was pretty awesome.
Yeah. So we're going to link those in the show notes. Those are part of the book resources. Chino is front and center in chapter 1 of my book. So you can get all the free book resources with or without book purchase at turnautismaround.com. But it's been a great journey. But Chino is also in the safety chapter. Because of these safety issues, knocking things over and with the newborn baby, which is not an uncommon thing.
Yeah.
He starts chapter 3 of my book with, well, maybe you want to tell the story. Do you remember the story?
So, there's a lot of safety stories. Yeah. Which one in particular?
Well, the one where the dresser drawers were empty.
Okay. So we go in his room. I don't remember if it was time to get dressed or, what part of our routine we were at, but there's no clothing in his room. And I'm like, where's the clothing going? So I noticed that the window is open. And so there were 2 windows in his bedroom, and I noticed that the one is open. And when I look, all of the clothing, I don't know if he had brought the top of the window down or
he's under 3 at this point.
And
he's not a huge kid.
No.
I mean, he's a normal looking 2.5-year-old. And all of a sudden, the second floor window of an older house is open, and all his clothes are out
clothing. There was clothing like on the roof, like on the awning of the back porch, and then my husband saw some all the way on the ground, like on her backyard. And I remember the one night I walked in, and what he did was he propped up on like the radiator and brought the top of the window down, and he had his hands out, and he was just like looking at the sky. And I'm like, whoa. So that's when we were like, okay, it's time to secure these windows.
Right. And he also left the house.
Yes, he left the house
once or
multiple
twice.
times. Yep.
And, they weren't on a major highway, but, a decent sized street, and the neighbors brought him back. And I remember, and Lucas did really unsafe things and escaped. And, but the roof story is like, whoa. Yeah. And I do know personally kids that have gotten out of windows and been on the roof. So like window locks, and then you have to make sure that adults can open windows in case of a fire. And so there's all those.
We actually ended up getting like a door chime. So whenever the door would open, we would know, okay, the door's opening. And it actually got to the point where, to this day, I feel kind of sad that we had to do this, but it got to the point where I had to put a lock on the outside of his bedroom so that if he did wake up before me, because we had some issues with like sleep regulation and staying asleep. So if it was 3-4 in the morning and he was waking up without me, I knew he wasn't trying to leave the house or get himself into trouble. I remember the one day, I was supposed to meet my husband for a morning like grocery store trip. He was getting out of 3rd shift, and I was going to go meet him. And at this time, he was already getting services with you. And I remember that we used to say like, go bye-bye when it was time to leave. But I learned that day that, he needed to know things very specifically and very at the moment that it needed to happen. So I had my oldest daughter, I ran upstairs to grab a brush. I had already said we were going to go bye-bye. I ran upstairs to grab a brush, and I hear like a minute or so later my doorbell ring. My door's open, and I'm like, why is my front door open? And I go look at the porch, and there's a woman holding my son, basically saying he was right outside just hanging out by the car. You know, because I said go bye-bye. So he's like, okay, this is happening right now. But it's like, it was really scary. And not just that, you know, as moms, we like to feel like we're on top of our kids and we're watching our kids. And for somebody else to bring your kid back to your doorstep, you know, it was like, wow. So that's when we really started noticing a lot of those safety issues. Yeah.
Yeah, and you have to use, you know, in chapter 3 of my book, you know, gates and hook and eye kind of doors and just being, but because, I mean, you also need to sleep.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
And if you have to stay awake, and our kids tend to have sleeping issues, which, you know, just complicates the thing. And then your husband's on a different shift, and I dealt with that when my kids were little too. It just gets really, really complicated.
And it's overwhelming.
Yeah. I feel bad for especially the parents now of, you know, little kids. And now we've got, you know, COVID on top of it.
I know.
And all of those complications. So back then, I know you had a big desire to raise your kids in a bilingual household.
Yeah.
Spanish and English, right?
Yeah.
So, and yeah, at the time I had, you know, very little experience with that. And so we kind of agreed that maybe we should just try to teach him like 10 words in English.
Yeah.
Because that's what I would speak. I mean, I could learn 10 words in Spanish as well, but it's not so much what I want or what you want, but like when he'd go to preschool, when he'd go to school, the language would be English. And so it's like, yes, typically developing kids can pick up 2 languages pretty easily, but especially if your husband and you are speaking both languages. But when you have a very delayed language learner, I think, you know, the researchers in the bilingual field feel strongly that it shouldn't matter and everything, but in my experience, it tends to matter. I have a video blog on it, and I have a podcast with Maggie, I think, Maggie. We can post those in the show notes. Those are about bilingual and speaking trilingual. But what were your thoughts? You had started to raise your first daughter bilingually, and so like what were you feeling?
So we spoke a lot of Spanish at home with my oldest child, and so to this day she's the one that understands it the most. She doesn't speak it much, but she understands pretty much everything that we say. With Chino, I think we did the right thing at the time, because coming from a child who's getting older, and he just had so many like aggression issues and frustration because he couldn't express himself at all. Usually with bilingual kids, it might take them a little longer to sort both languages out, but they do fine in the long run. But with Chino, we wanted to make sure, like, you know, he's already delayed. Can he just talk at all? Like, will he use language? And once we started doing the combination of that and the program, I mean, he took off. He started learning words like right away. So, I mean, he understands a little bit of Spanish today. I think that because he's surrounded, he hears me speak to people in Spanish, he hears it at church. I think there's still time. There's still a good chance. There's always time.
11.
You know? He's 11, yeah.
So
I have a little preteen now. He'll be 12 in a few months.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you think you did the right thing, and so, but it is a personal decision.
Yeah.
And there's people from all over the world listening, and some families speak 3 languages.
Yeah.
And if you think about like teaching sign language or teaching the first words, you know, if you have to teach it, you know, if I were trying to learn a second language, you know, and I was, and I was just concentrating on Spanish or Japanese. But now if you said, you know what, we're going to try to teach you both languages
at the same time, And you were already having trouble even acquiring language.
Yeah, it would be a little tough. So I do say, in my experience, not based on real research, but I don't think there's real research with kids with moderate to severe autism learning two languages from the start.
Yeah.
So I'd say stick with one and stick with the language that is going to be most accessible to the early intervention professionals, to preschool, and to regular school.
And not just that, but, with the program and everything you taught us, things had to be very consistent. So you wanted to make sure, they had to be consistent, repetitive. Like, it was an all the time thing.
Right.
So you wanted to make sure you weren't really switching things up.
Right.
Honestly.
Right. Like, we literally go water, water, water. And if half the time, or if her husband was like, agua, agua, agua,
exactly.
It's like, that doesn't make him bilingual. And that also doesn't make him conversational in either of those languages. So we're not talking about conversational anything. We're talking about building blocks, then, other forms of verbal behavior. And it is really complicated.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you're a teacher and you're also a pastor at a church. And so I remember also back then that you did have a desire early on to, you were a big religious family.
Yes.
And you wanted to bring your kids to church. And that was a struggle for Chino to, participate in Sunday school and keeping your eye on. You wanted to be an active member of the church, not just sitting there in the pew.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so then you got all these safety issues, and now you have 3 little kids and one with with moderate to severe autism. So, how did that go with the religious participation early on?
So I think there's a few things I have to speak to that. I think that I was very blessed that I had a good support system at church. I had a few close friends who had interacted with Chino enough for him to feel comfortable around them. But it was still a very big challenge. Actually, he just went to, on Wednesday nights, we have our midweek service where we do like a Bible study, and like the adults go and the kids, and everyone's in their little groups. And he just, I want to say 2 weeks ago or so, he just sat through a Bible class successful. So he's almost 12. It took a long time. A lot of it was having him with me, having the support system. There were times where I do have memories of getting to church and him not even wanting to go in or tantruming severely. There's music, there's people, it's and and then again, I mean, Chino could do it. There might be someone whose child, has more of that in the sensory issue in that area, with like sounds and stuff, but he did fine. Honestly, I think now it gets to the point where actually, I remember us taking like a portable DVD player
with headphones.
And headphones. We had like a box with toys. And so I think because our church is like charismatic too, and there's a lot going on, and I think it kind of drowns out a little bit of like his noise, so it was okay. But if it was probably a lot more traditional and quiet service, I don't know how we would have done it. Yeah, it was hard. And still today, I mean, it's probably, religion is important to him, and spirituality and his relationship with God are important to him, but he just views it, I think, very differently. It's hard for him to sit through an entire service still. So there's just a lot of things that we do at home to reinforce that, the importance of the religion.
Yeah, wow. Does he know that he has autism? And
yes.
How did you tell him?
Yeah. So he's very, very well aware that he has autism. I don't remember the exact moment, but I think it was around 2nd grade, and I did sit down and talk to him directly about it. I wanted him to be able to advocate for himself, identify when he was feeling uncomfortable, and all those things. Does he feel... I don't think he feels badly about it, like he's super different, but he's very well aware that his needs are different.
Does he have friends with autism, or is he's in general
Because
education?
he's in regular ed, I feel like that might be one of the reasons for why his friends are. He has all typical friends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he doesn't really talk to them like I have autism.
No.
Yeah.
It hasn't gotten to that point yet.
Yeah.
His friends know that, he might struggle a little bit or have a bad day here and there. But I think he's able, because he's so high functioning, I think he's able to do okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So he's fully conversational.
He's fully conversational.
Can read, do math.
Oh, he can do math. He's great with math. He actually, his school does this national math challenge, and in his school district and in his grade, I think he placed like second place and got like a national honorable mention or something like that. He's brilliant with math.
Nice.
Again, talking about the language arts piece, he can tell you everything that happened in a story. He can comprehend it. Now, if we were saying, how do you think the author felt at this point? Those questions, that's tough for him still. Yeah. Why do you think the author chose to do this? Or why did that person say that? Those kinds of things are still difficult for him. Can we get him to do them? Yes. Usually it requires somewhat of a meltdown. I don't want to do this. It's very non-preferred.
And how about writing paragraphs?
Yeah.
Is that
okay?
He
can do it. He's great. But he doesn't like to do it.
A lot of work.
It's just something, yes. I know, people might think there's a lot of kids that don't like school or don't like to do something. For him, it really requires a lot of effort.
Because it's not the mechanics of writing.
No.
It's the comprehension, it's the putting it together, organizing your thoughts.
Right.
And then writing it,
Exactly.
spelling, spacing.
Exactly.
And, I know a lot of older kids that go on, with autism, and they're pretty indistinguishable in some ways. Like they do a lot of dictation and typing, and, because that at least takes some of the fine motor out of it.
Yeah.
In addition to that, and you had also shared that he also has a diagnosis of ADD, and he's on medication.
Yes.
At some points.
In kindergarten, as I was trying to teach in my own classroom at work, at this time I was back to work, he started kindergarten, and I would get phone calls like every other day. Like it was just so hard for his special education team to find a program like that worked for him, because he's so high functioning. But then he has all these like emotional regulation struggles. I even remember at a time wanting a certain therapist wanting to categorize him as ED, emotionally disturbed. And I really didn't want him to end up in that kind of classroom, because I didn't think that's what he needed. Eventually, a few years in, after some meds and weaving in some emotional support, but keeping him in the regular ed classroom, he started doing better. But he can't go to a full day of school without taking his medication. I had him seen by a psychiatrist like in around first grade, because we just couldn't.
Yeah.
And I had always promised myself I wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
So that was huge for me.
Yeah.
I cried.
With medication.
Yeah, that was huge, because I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. And then I realized, like, this is not so much about what I want. I need him to function in school.
Right.
I need him to function in society. So
yeah. And I did a podcast episode with Dr. Michael Murray. I know I probably say this every episode. It seems like I'm mentioning that episode. We can link it in the show notes. But the medication that Lucas has been on since age 18 has literally changed his life.
Yeah.
And for the positive.
Yeah.
And I've never been really against medication, but especially with kids that aren't conversational, like can't really tell you how they're feeling. There are just so many side effects that, you could end up making the matter even worse. So I'm interested to know, like, as a teacher in general, now you have your master's in special ed, which was recent. Congratulations.
Yep, thank you.
So what advice would you have for general education teachers? After all that you've gone through with Chino and with getting your master's degree, I'm sure you're like kind of come full circle now.
Yeah. I think that the relationship between, especially for kids like Chino who are not in like a self-contained classroom, I think that the relationship between the general education teacher and the special ed teacher is key. I think that having a behavioral system in place is huge.
Having a behavior analyst,
yes,
preferably kind of overseeing the case, the school, the classroom.
That and has not done a difference.
Not to just put out fires, but to actually be a part of his, not just if he's having a problem.
Exactly.
His whole school system, so that there's a baton passing and that there's somebody that's going to focus on the positives and going to focus on preventing problems.
And I was just going to say prevention. Prevention is key. And if you're focused on the positives, then just prevention. I honestly, having Chino helped me in the past 3 years or so. I've had 2 or 3 students with autism in my classroom. And I'm a foreign language teacher, so I'm a Spanish teacher. And they're teenagers, juniors, seniors in high school. So it's very different from Chino, but they've kind of reminded me a lot of him at the same time. And they're kids that if I had not read their IEPs, I probably would still know that they were on the spectrum. Chino has just opened up my eyes so much to meeting students' needs. But the biggest thing that I see in the educational world is that kids like Chino are often falling through the cracks because they're so high functioning. So you have all these, you have A's, even how fast he would finish his work was an issue, right? So he'd finish his work really, really quickly, and then he'd be bored, so he'd start looking at other things to do, right? And they involved misbehavior. So then he would get enrichment, which was busy work, and he knew it was busy work. So because again, he's high functioning, he's smart enough to understand that. And so I think when you see the high functioning, but you still see those behaviors, it's a key indicator that there's something deeper going on. And you have to program and try and prevent as much as you can.
So if you could pick out of any teacher, for a general ed teacher for Chino, what kind of qualities would you be looking for to say, yeah, I think she'll be really good?
Consistent. He had a teacher in one of his grades that did really, really well. He had a little bit of a hard time going into the 3rd and 4th quarter, but that was his best school year. And the one thing was she was very, very routine oriented. You always knew what to expect. So being high functioning, with high functioning autism, he needed that whole routine, the structure, knowing. But there were some issues with a lack of flexibility. So it's so weird because it's like there has to be a blend of both. There has to, and that's hard. And that's really hard for some teachers to do.
Right.
And the other thing is, for some reason, I don't know why, Chino has always preferred males.
And you don't get a lot of those in elementary school.
No, you don't. So he's had, honestly, the fact that his BSCs and TSS workers have been able to go to the school with him and were males made the difference.
So does he get those support services now still?
Not anymore.
Okay, so that BSC is a behavior specialist. And TSS is like a RBT or a therapist in Pennsylvania.
So the TSS support had been phased out maybe 2 years ago.
Okay.
And then we just completed, at the end of May, we just phased out the behavior specialist.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah.
He
So
does
for many years.
He
had that kind of support.
Exactly.
And one of the things I do want to mention, there's a lot of people that, say high functioning versus low functioning.
Yeah.
And it is really, that's one of the problems is like labeling a kid like Chino as high functioning. And then any behaviors are just because he's being bad or he's being stubborn.
And people think that in public, like sometimes,
And so I did do a podcast, actually one of my very first podcasts on high functioning versus low functioning. So we can link that in the show notes, because within each child or adult, there's their strengths and their needs, and that's it.
Yep.
So he could be super high functioning in math and X, Y, and Z, and be moderately functioning with these other skills. And he's a complex individual, and he's growing. And so every year, and then you've got things like a teacher that's super flexible, or a teacher that's super positive, or you have, you're coming up to puberty soon.
Yes.
And before, last year, now we had COVID. And so every time you turn around, there could be a whole nother set of variables that are affecting him. Just like you have two typically developing daughters, and they also get affected by different things. And so there's no such thing as normal versus abnormal.
Absolutely.
And there's no such thing as, smart versus stupid, or high functioning versus low functioning. And so we all need to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
And I think, consistency is what I'd look for. I'd look for... I personally look for therapists and teachers who are willing to learn, who are
the person
positive, who are willing to work with me.
Yes.
And not like, I don't care, take somebody off the street. They don't need years and years and years of experience. They just need to know that the family is the expert.
Absolutely.
And we need to work and coordinate.
That school and home relationship is also very big, and I am thankful for that, because the schools that Chino has been in, they are always saying, are you seeing this at home? What's going on at home? What's your routine like at home? And of course, as a mom, I've always advocated for that too, but it's just, I think it all comes down to this, and for those who watch, who may be educators, it's all about relationship building.
With everybody.
If with everyone, like if you know your student, you're going to want to service that student. You're going to want to do what they need, right? You're going to want to meet them where they're at. And that's what it's all about, really, at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. So, any other advice for like a parent who is just seeing signs or just got a diagnosis? If you could look back, a decade ago, what advice would you give to yourself back then?
It will be okay, right? Because at first I felt like I was drowning. I felt like I would never get the hang of it. I wasn't enough, all these things. For me, the biggest things were, it's going to get better. As long as the biggest thing is, when you have your home routine and you decide what structure you're going to have, you have to have, your child at the center of it. Because sometimes, we envision things a certain way, and maybe typical kids can adapt to the way we want to do things, but kids on the spectrum struggle with that, and there might be things that you just have to say, okay, this is what my child needs, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm not going to be able to do. The more time we spend trying to force a different way or trying to be in denial instead of focusing on the needs, the more time we waste that could have been time working toward progress. It's overwhelming, so I would tell moms it does get better. I think one thing that my husband and I still struggle with is, how much do we force Chino to do? So let's say we get a party invitation. He hates parties. He hates the music. He hates the people. He just doesn't like,
being in a loud
He does not like it. So I'm the type of person that says, well, why don't we find someone to stay with him, or he can go on a play date that day. And my husband thinks, No,
We
he's
should
a part
bring
of the family. We're not going to go anywhere, without him. And so that's a whole nother thing too, just parents, listen to each other, try to work it out and see what it is because it's a lot of stress too on the parents, like when there's more than one parent in the home.
And more than one child.
And more than one child, because yes, I'm doing what's going to work for Chino, but then is it going to work for my girls? And at the end of the day, someone might be upset, but you just got to make it through the day.
Yeah, yeah.
And just survive and do what's best.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just be resilient.
And it could change. It could, you might decide like today, we're not going to make him go to the party and da-da-da.
Exactly.
And then maybe, he could try a half an hour of a party another time.
Exactly.
Maybe the stressors will be easier to deal with. And maybe summertime parties are easier outside.
Yeah.
And
my husband usually tries to provide. I think one thing that he learned really well was like the reinforcement. So he usually tries to do some kind of system, with Chino where, a lot of positive, like, yes, you can do this, we're going to do this. And it's funny because I just had a parent in my church office a few days ago who was speaking to me about some concerns that he had with his daughter, and he's presenting them to me and telling me how when he brings her to church and she gets upset and he has to step out. And I was almost you that day. I'm like, well, you might have to, by taking her out, you might actually be teaching her that if she misbehaves, she'll get what she wants and she'll get to go out. So, but it's just so nice because, you get to help other people around you with this knowledge. Moms of newly diagnosed kids, or if you think your kid is struggling, find a support system, other moms. I remember emailing a complete stranger when I first found out because we had a friend in common. And she's like, you got to email this lady. I mean...
Yeah. Yep. Some of my best friends in the autism world I met right away. Yeah. It's just great. So, part of my podcast goals are for parents and professionals to be less stressed and lead happier lives. So what kind of stress reduction strategies would you recommend for parents and professionals? Maybe something you do or...
So as a parent, I think self-care is really big. And I think, when we have a lot on our plates, knowing when we need a break is really important because children on the autism spectrum can, you become exhausted. Think about how like hyper vigilant you have to be. You talk about prevention. It's like,
you gotta be stressed out.
Exactly. So just make sure you build time and routine. The good thing is they do respond to structure. At least Chino did. So that's really one thing that really helped me. The schedule. Lots of self-care. I'm trying to think along the lines of like the party thing I was telling you. If you can't, do something, just know that one day it might change, like you said, because it has changed for us. There's times where he's going through stages. And probably don't be too concerned about what the people around you think. Yeah. Because, as a parent, it can be rough when you're out in public and someone thinks you just don't discipline your child or you don't know what you're doing or your kid's just being a brat. That's very stressful and you do not live a happy life.
Right. And if you're listening to the podcast, we're kind of preaching to the choir because if you're listening to this podcast, and you're, whether you're a professional or a parent, you're not going to judge other people outside because we all know how difficult it is and just try to be positive. I think, try to be positive with yourself and with others. And,
And, I think a lot of us being stressed and being happy or unhappy is like where our expectations lie. So you've got to be real with yourself. Like, how much am I really going to be able to do? What am I going to be able to do? And I had to learn that my house probably was not going to be as clean as I wanted it to be, right? I had to learn that I had to have a certain amount of canned food in the cabinet because Moises, Chino, would come down every morning. That was the first thing he did, come down and pile up all the cans.
I remember that.
Every single day. You know, he still remembers that.
Oh, wow.
He said that to me the other day. I said, you remember that? He still remembers that. And, you know, just the little things like that. You know, I couldn't cook an elaborate dinner. Guess what? We're having ice cream for dinner today. You know, just give yourself grace and be kind to yourself.
That's awesome. Well, I think that's a great way to end. I look forward to hearing what the next 10 years brings for Chino.
I know.
It sounds like the sky's the limit. And
he's such an awesome child.
You are an amazing mom, and Abe is an amazing dad. So I think you're going to do well. Thank you again for sharing your story on this podcast, in the book, in the videos. It has made everyone more hopeful, and I do get a lot of requests for how's Chino doing now.
Oh,
so
that's
now
awesome.
we have a little update, and hopefully maybe in a few years you can come back and update us more.
Thank you.
Thank you. If you're a parent or early intervention professional working with young children with signs of autism, or if you're a parent or professional helping older children with moderate to severe autism, you'll definitely want to order my new Turn Autism Around book today. You'll get access to all the book resources that will help you right away. For all the details, go to turnautismaround.com.